Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the June 24th virtual Agile Shift session. Before we start, I want to inform you about a feature in the presentation that'll make the session more interactive. Please make note of the question mark icon at the upper right of the presentation screen. Clicking that icon will open the question and answer feature, which allows you to send our moderator questions to be delivered to our presenters at the appropriate time. I'm excited to introduce two of my favorite Agilists today, Shannon DeMarco, Director of Agility Products at BP, and Stephanie Smith, Director of Agility and Digital Leadership at BP, will be sharing 10 Agile practices for working together remotely. Shannon and Stephanie, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Shervin, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We're really looking forward to the next hour together. So I'd just like everyone to take a minute and reflect back to the fourth quarter of 2019. All the plans we had made, all the budgets that we had agreed, everything that we were setting out and prepared to do in 2020. And then in February, everything changed. We heard about a virus, a true unknown, the thing that agility is meant to help us maneuver. And now, 4 months later, a continued test of the world's largest work from home experiment. So today, what we're going to be sharing with you are the 10 best practices for working together remotely. This is a class, a virtual one, of course, that we introduced into BP in March. The intent was to help our teams make the transition to working remotely in both our home life and then, of course, in our work life, and how we're going to collaborate with our teams. And when you think about BP, we're a company of roughly 70,000 people working across 78 countries. And the big reliance we're going to have about how our ways of working and our technology to do that. So our goal today is to share that session with you so you can get a flavor of it, and then hopefully some learnings that you may be able to bring back to your different companies or your teams. So with everything, and particularly in Agile, it's about the quality of the time that we have together and the clarity of the agenda. So one of the things today we want to be cognizant of is we're expecting upwards of up to 200 people on the call. That's roughly 12,000 minutes of time. So we want to make sure that our learning objectives for our time together are clear. And again, that you leave with more than you started with. So here's what we plan to cover today. First, we're going to give a little bit of context about BP's journey. So why is an energy company here talking about agility? And then we're going to talk about directly in terms of the session and what is the transition to working from home. How do we develop new team agreements, new team cultures on how we're going to collaborate remotely? About some Agile practices that can be applied in this time to get real-time transparency and inclusion in what can be quite daunting. About how to make Agile accessible and inclusive for new entrants. We had been on an Agile journey, but it didn't cover the whole company. But when we had the impacts of COVID and working remotely, it became important to share that more broadly. And then how to promote continuous learning. So this is where we're going to be going today. Hopefully that meets your expectations, but you can let us know that at the end of the session. So first, with some context. So BP started its transformation back in 2016. Our journey has been focused very much on digital, agile, and mindsets, three things that are inextricably linked. It's been a review of how to adopt the latest technologies. Energy companies are not necessarily tech companies, but as many of you know, because you either work in the industry or in the service industry related to it, that everything we do involves some form of technology. So we have a lot of heavy assets and hardware. We tend to put a lot of software, sensors, and everything on top of that hardware. So the line between hardware and software is very blurred for us. And it was about how to make more out of digital. And that includes around automation, artificial intelligence, and so on, including my partner Stephanie on the call today, a lot of work that she's been leading on how to reskill and upskill our folks into being things like data scientists. So in short, for the last 3 years, we've been very intensely working this agenda. In order to deliver digital, you need Agile. And so in the space of agility, it's about applying the learning from the tech industry to how we do it in energy. Important to note, this has not been limited to our IT teams. quite the opposite. And this has been actually about our business-facing teams applying the Agile mindsets and practices to activities like delivering new wells, managing inventory, and it does also include developing new digital programs as well. And then, of course, mindset, and mindset being at the core of everything. Being in Houston, many of you are probably familiar with BP, and you may have heard about an update to our strategy. So in February, just a few weeks before the world changed, we went quite visible and transparent with our new agenda. And this is about reimagining energy for people and the planet. So BP announced an ambition that will look at how our operations, our portfolio will change over the next while with a sole ambition of net zero by 2050. So that's net zero emissions by 2050. Interesting to announce this agenda and then a few weeks later to see the shutdown that came with COVID, and ultimately as well things like clear skies happening in cities that hadn't seen blue skies for some time. So I think in a way the learnings that we're getting from COVID are just reinforcing the need for this agenda and the direction. As we all know, as Agilists, agility is not the strategy, but agility is going to be part of our means to get to reinventing BP and reimagining energy. So very important component, and something we're doing a lot of work on in the company at the moment is how agility helps us with this. And of course, we're going to repeat this over and over again, but the mindsets. So keep in mind, we're a more traditional company. We've been in place for over 100 years. We're asking people that have had certain workflows and technologies and all of that for sometimes over 30 to 40 years. We're asking them to change their perspective, to change the way they think and approach their work, the way that they collaborate, everything. And what we're finding is it doesn't matter, it's not about ageism, it's solely about mindsets and people's inner agility and how they embrace these new things, right? And this is what we'll need to deliver reinventing BP as well. So this is just a little bit of context for you, not going into great lengths of detail, but hopefully gives you a flavor of BP's Agile journey, where we've been for the last 2.5 years. We had a lot of great learnings from our Agile pilots that we've done, and again, a lot of great outcomes from the practices. And when COVID happened, we had to step back and say, well, surely we can apply this now. We need to turn this learning around and make it real for everyone. So let's just talk you through briefly. What did we do to reach over 3,000 people with new ways of working in an unprecedented time? And so we started with, what are the pain points? What were our people telling us about this transition to remote working? So for many of you, remote working is the norm. You've been working remotely for years, but in our company, working in an office is the norm. We have, you're either out in an operational asset or you're office based. So it was quite a switch to now be located at home. So we needed to understand what that meant for our folks and what they were struggling with. From there, to craft a deck around that. So what is the storyline? What are the key Agile practices to focus on that we could share at scale? And what would the materials look like? Keep in mind, working across 78 countries, we're dealing with a lot of different cultures, different languages, and we need to make sure that we do things that translate easily. We need to put in place a script so that if we're delivering it multiple times, is that we do it in a consistent way. We needed to advertise. So many of you are Microsoft shops as well. So how we would get the message out on Yammer. We didn't have time to do formal integration into registrations and all of that. So it was around how to almost crowdsource attendance for this. On the bright side, we did have a captive audience, which certainly made it easier to get attendance. And then, of course, how you deliver across time zones. When you're working in international companies, so important to be inclusive. And sometimes that means 5 a.m. in Houston, but it means that you're being inclusive to those folks working across the oceans over in Australia and so on. About keeping this available. So even today, it's been shared to us that about half the attendees will be in person, the other half will watch later at a time that better suits. So same thing as you're designing sessions, making sure that you are taking steps to record and make them available for those that can't join. And then about repeating and crowdsourcing. And by crowdsourcing, this is about how to actually create something that can be taken. So by developing a deck, by writing a script, we were then able to issue this out to a network of folks that were then able to repeat it in their countries and businesses and managed to do so to the tune of actually doubling our reach. And so it worked out very well. We were able to, by doing this as well, they were able to localize for their context as needed. And then last, to, of course, take this as a practice and share it at a big virtual Agile conference named Agile Shift 2020. So this is how we've gotten to the point we're at today. In this graphic, what you'll find is this is one of our team's calls, and our actual CEO is over there, and he's in the top left quadrant there, the second one in the second row. So that's Bernard. So everybody participates. So with that context, I want to go ahead and move on. And at this part, we're actually going to take you through the session that we delivered. So this is the session that we called 10 Practices for Working Together Remotely. Quite deliberate. We really want to emphasize collaboration and the idea that we continue to work together, even if it's through a digital interface. And so this is the actual content and the material that we used. And again, hopefully with the idea that you can reuse it as you see fit. So again, we're in an unprecedented moment. We're sharing something in common like never before. So COVID has indeed been a global experience. We are all watching together, we are learning together, and we're just desperately hoping that things will get better. And particularly in Houston today and other parts of the US, watching the numbers climb. So it continues to be overwhelming. And I think this is an important point. When we first delivered this session, it was at the outset of COVID. We didn't think this would keep going. We thought it was temporary. We thought we would be back in the offices by now. And what we're learning instead is that it's indefinite. We're waiting for true agility. We're waiting for vaccinations and things that will allow us to come back together again. So in the spirit of controlling what we can control, today we're going to talk about our own inner agility and then our agile practices for working together across our teams. We always like to remind our teams about the definition of agility and our ability to adapt, and a direct link of that to survival. It's been incredible during COVID to be talking about agility and to watch all of the examples around us as well. But as you think about the context I've shared already with reinventing BP, you know, agility is all about responsiveness, and it's going to be our ability to respond to the learnings from COVID and what it's going to mean to actually achieve net zero by 2050. So this is all about behaving more of like an organism versus as a more traditional hierarchical construct. So when we, a lot of folks, agility has been, I'm not sure about your companies or businesses, but for us, agility has sometimes been confused with things like working from home, which a big point of confusion during COVID. So we always like to start the outset of our decks and talk about what agility actually means. So again, right now we've got more examples than ever before happening around us. And so really important to just touch on some of those. In just 4 months, the economy, the companies, the workforce that underpin it have massively been impacted by the crisis. Companies have evolved in unprecedented ways to respond. So again, what we'd relate to as their agility. We've seen everything from hotels being repurposed as hospitals, given that they have no rooms sold at the moment. We've also seen many of you probably at a personal level experiencing becoming a teacher or a caregiver for your children, right? Or a principal, depending on how things are going as you're running the homeschool approach. We've seen my own son actually graduated his senior year of college during COVID at home while trying to finish online. Quite a different experience, both for the kids, but also for the parents who are learning what it's like to be a teacher. So I think a lot of us have even more gratitude now for our teachers. We've seen incredible innovation. So the leader of Dyson, the original innovator, actually coming up with a ventilator in 10 days. So we know what's possible. And this is a message we're always telling our teams. If you put a group of people together with the right mindsets and give them space and a clear mission, it will be incredible what they're capable of doing. And I think we're seeing that from folks like Dyson. Then realizing our incredible dependency on the vaccine, right? Vaccines normally take 6 to 10 years. What we're hoping for is less than 18 months, right? To allow us to return to normalcy, to get the economy back on track. Most importantly, to stop the human tragedy of the losses that many are experiencing. And then, of course, we're just seeing, you know, in our own world, and there's so many factories and manufacturing plants and so on in Houston, but how many folks have been able to change production lines to fight the coronavirus, right? Whether that is producing ventilators, but also things like turning around a gin distillery to produce hand sanitizer, right? So you're just seeing all sorts of innovation everywhere. And this is fairly common. Crisis usually inspires innovation, but the scale and the enormity of it, I think, is quite unique. And it's been a very simple way for us to help our folks relate to when we say agility, what do we mean? And it's the experience that we're all sharing at the moment and the observations we all have at the moment of what's happening around us. And of course, what it's meant for us as humans. I mentioned, many of us becoming teachers that ordinarily aren't, trying to coax our children through their homeschooling efforts, also becoming caregivers, right? Little ones that had previously been in care are now at home running around while you're trying to be on calls during the day and so on. And so we all looked quite slick at the beginning of quarantine. We had it together. We were turning up on time, looking pretty put together. This is Ash, one of my colleagues in London. And then about 12 weeks into quarantine, it kept going, right? And it got a little bit more impactful and exhausting. So just a fun way to look at what it's meant for us on the personal level, I think, as we've continued through this. So it's been really important, and this was a key part of our session. It's about being kind and understanding. Don't pretend to walk in somebody else's shoes. Everyone has a different scenario, a different home scenario. Some are caring for littles, some are caring for elders, some are dealing with their own personal challenges during this time, whether that's mental health or physical health and the worries that the virus brings. So this isn't normal. It's completely unprecedented, which means we shouldn't pretend to hold on to the normal protocols of the office. It's about finding our way together and doing our best and really, having that spirit of community throughout. So this is very important as we go through this and continue to go through this. Again, we thought it would be done. We thought we'd be back together, and we're not. So we need to revisit this and make sure that we're still exercising the kindness and generosity we were in the early days, despite how tiring it's getting. And I don't mean tiring of being generous, I mean tiring of being in quarantine. So here's the 10 practices for working together remotely. So it's about home. So the things that we do together at home and using the Agile practices to create the environment that is supportive and enduring during COVID. And then what we do as a team. And just a fun photo to share with you. This is the dog we adopted, like many, during quarantine. This is Kahali, and she likes to desk surf when I'm on conference calls. So she clearly needs a working agreement about what's appropriate and what's not. So we're going to talk through these now. And again, we really like to emphasize this point about home. You need to get the home sorted so that you can also stay focused on work. And so it's quite an adjustment. Again, most of us were office-based workers. We didn't have clearly delineated offices. We didn't have a clear definition of what it meant for hours and so on. And all of a sudden our partners and spouses or roommates are going, oh, so that's what you do all day. How do you sit on calls all day? So very interesting. But what you need to then do is agree, okay, given this environment, given we're trying to do school, we're trying to do work, and we're trying to live in the same space, what are our working agreements? And I think, like many of you, at the outset of launching an Agile team, the most important thing has been to establish the working agreement. And so we think for your home and then for your team, this remains the most important thing. So obviously there's the element of safety. What are the agreements in the house around safety? So washing the hands for the 20 seconds as advised. Routine disinfecting of the home, again, particularly as we see cases on a surge again. It's about agreeing who's going to do what when. When we have two working parents with small children, they have to take shifts, right? So they're not going to be available at the same time. So how do we work that out? And about where are we going to put our home offices? How do you create dedicated spaces to work from? And how do you get signals in place for indicating when you can't be disturbed and when you can? So similar to our Agile teams, we'd encourage you to be taking and setting up your working agreement for home. Again, getting the group together, your roommates or your families together and saying, what is it we're committing to? How are we going to look out for each other during this time? And putting it on the wall, making it very clear, very accessible for everyone. It's around setting boundaries. Again, for most of us, we haven't learned how to be a home worker, and it is very difficult to find a separation. Blurred lines, very blurred lines when you're working from home because you're constantly walking by your office, and it's just too tempting to stop and check mail, to do one more thing, and then soon enough it's midnight and you're wondering where the time has gone, and the first meeting's at 6. So there's a rumor that folks that work from home have more time than those that work in the office. But actually the studies that have been done show that remote workers really struggle to unplug. right? And part of it is because the expectations we make of them. So really important in your home life, set boundaries. What are your office hours? And make sure that that's clear again with your roommates or your family. And then use the data. And we love data, we love empiricism. What is the data telling you about how well you're holding to your boundaries? Does it support or disprove your hypothesis that you've learned to balance your time? Next, use the tools. Set up the Kanban board. We had some brilliant examples from our team members about setting up Kanban boards and how they were able to use them, including with the kids. So one thing about COVID is we lost a lot of structure very quickly. The children are used to getting up, they're used to going to school, they're used to very set schedules. And we went into this time that is highly unstructured, which isn't super helpful, right? And that's true for children, it's true for us, and it's true for our parents or our grandparents, whoever is with us. And so creating a Kanban board and making the activities that need to be done clear, super helpful is what we found. And so we've got two examples here. One of our team members in Egypt set up the Kanban board for the kids about all of their activities. They own it, they've got accountability for it, about their tasks and where they're at. And again, this is Egypt. This translates in a wonderful way across countries. And then we've got another one of another parent that set up a schedule for their kids to talk about what needs to happen when, including some incentives. So you notice here that kids that follow the schedule get the later bedtime. The kids that don't follow the schedule get the earlier bedtime. So help them out. It's more important than you might think. And reality is we're continuing in this space. So if you haven't done it yet, it is not too late to set up a board and to create some structure. On a personal level, I have a 22-year-old, and he also shared that he was really struggling during COVID without structure and needed to take this action to stabilize his time as well. And then there's the working agreements. We cannot emphasize enough the importance of the working agreements for the team. So we've talked about it for the home, setting that up, making it visible, and doing it in a collaborative way with the family. But now it's around how you do that with your team. And again, I mentioned BP, and we've piloted something in the neighborhood of around 500 Agile teams, but this isn't limited to them. This is about our Agile teams, our non-Agile teams, it doesn't matter. It's about teams and revisiting what is our working agreement during this time. It needs to be reset because the conditions that we had before are not the conditions we have now. So what we were recommending to our teams is to have a realistic and honest conversation about circumstance. What is each team member situation? Are they caring for others? What is their realistic capacity? It's not likely 40 hours, right? So what capacity do they have so that we can make sure we prioritize and spend it well? What is the technology and what level of Wi-Fi do the team members have access to? And then what are we going to do? How are we going to treat each other during this time? What are our commitments? And this is around things like checking on each other at the beginning of every meeting. You know, we do love the discipline of the 15-minute daily session. However, right now, we need to take a few minutes and ask how folks are doing. And we need to be careful not to lose this. Just because we're 4 months into COVID, it doesn't mean we should stop some of those practices. If anything, we should be reinforcing and amplifying them. Because now that we're 4 months in, again, people are getting very tired. So we need to be checking on each other at the beginning of the meeting. We need very simple and clear agendas. Now is not the time to be having non-essential meetings. When you do have meetings, limiting them to 45 minutes. For one reason, there's some science here as well. Humans can only pay attention for 45 minutes. So having meetings any longer than that just likely means to people diverting to their phones or to other distractions. Also, 45 minutes is very practical in the sense that it leaves people time to take a bio break, to get coffee or refill ahead of their next session. The other one is to start and finish on time. If there was ever a time for discipline, it is now. People have, like we mentioned, some folks are working shifts. So keeping them over on a call means you might be holding their spouse or partner up from getting on their next call because of watching littles or elders. Okay, it's about starting, starting and finishing on time, like I mentioned, and then the openness and honesty of the team. Now, if there's an issue, if there's something wrong, and it's really important that we have our cameras on to see the body language, is that we're raising it early. It's not the right time for people to be going to sleep stewing on things or worrying about things. If you see an issue, is that as a team, you're agreeing to surface them and have that respectful debate quickly and settle any concerns. When creating the team working agreements right now, it's also the clarity of just being incredibly specific. So how will the team communicate and what formats, and making sure the team members know how to use them. So we've got different technologies. I know we're all working across different companies, so that might be Skype, Teams, Zoom, but agreeing that, and again, making sure the team's had a tutorial and can use them effectively. Which chat? How are you going to stay in touch? Which ones are for formal, ongoing business dialogue? Which ones might be just for sharing pictures of the latest escapades or latest hobbies during COVID? How well the gardening project has turned out, or how well the organization project has turned out. And then, of course, the video. Looking back at that photo of Ash and how we looked at the beginning of COVID and how we look now, you might notice people are starting to turn their video off again. It's under the guise of, I haven't had enough time to get ready, or I haven't cleaned up the house, or, we're actually getting to know each other more than we did in the office, because we are literally visiting each other's homes right now. We are in our living rooms, we are in our bedrooms, we are in offices, and sometimes we're in garages, wherever you've managed to find an office. And so we need to be respectful of that, because we're getting to meet partners and spouses and roommates and four-legged friends. It's a very different scenario, and really important that we be quite human about treating that respectfully. So hopefully this helps. Again, we had a lot of teams that had working agreements in place, but we urge them to revisit those working agreements and make sure they were relevant to this time. Some reasons around this as well. I think many of you have probably heard of Project Aristotle and the Google study to understand what makes a high-performing team. Google spent 2 years examining the habits of teams and understanding what characteristics. Of course, a fantastic data set drawing on the experience of 37,000 people. And what they found was it wasn't so much who was on your team, but how the team works together. And so much of that is defined and committed to through the working agreement. Right, and very much in the spirit of, it's called Project Aristotle because the sum is greater than the whole, or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, excuse me. A really fun and great example from funscrummaster.com of working agreement, be on time, end on time. Do not interrupt others while they're sharing. Another finding from the Google study was teams that commit to an equal amount of listening and talking. So if you're looking across a team of 7, that you're hearing an equal share of listening and talking across that team generally indicates a very healthy team culture and a strong level of psychological safety. If you have been sitting on a lot of calls lately where only 1 or 2 people are talking, it's probably time to call stop and to revisit either why so many people are on the meeting or why only 2 people are talking. And there's never been a more important time for transparency and honesty. Remember, because people are working dual shifts, because there's so many competing obligations with either the schooling or the childcare or caring for elders, is that we need to do things that drive transparency so that people don't feel left out. And we'll talk more about that later as we talk about collaboration and which tools we use. So some other really great ones we've used are no blame culture, being present, and so on. And of course, back to mindsets. I'm not sure you can ever talk about mindset enough, because it is the core, the heart of agility. And this is about what we own, right? With everything, it is control what you can control. And then it's about the team. So at an individual level, it's about each of us taking account for our actions, for our contributions to the team, but also for our commitment to that working agreement, that we are being transparent, that we are being open, that we are raising issues as we see them arise. It's about communicating. Don't assume anything. I've sat in at least 3 conversations in the last week where if we hadn't clarified, we may have run in entirely different directions. So if something sounds a little off or it's not clear, it's making sure to take the time and communicate and clarify. It's about assuming good intent. Everyone does mean well, but these are extraordinary circumstances, and we need to be generous with people. Get to know your teammates. Again, we are in each other's living rooms. It's time to get to know the names of the family. It's time to understand people and what motivates them and what compels them to contribute. Knowing how they like to communicate. Some people love WhatsApp, some people love texting, and some people love video. Very important to take the time to understand that. Know where people are. Continuing to set up meetings at 5 a.m. is not very inclusive and not very kind, right? People need rest. So making sure you understand where people are and that you're being inclusive with the times that you set for meetings and interactions. Also very important for the team because they're not going to be able, particularly for our company, we work in different countries, as there may only be a 2 to 3 hour window that we're able to collaborate. So as part of the working agreement is defining that and saying, when are we going to be available to each other? And then I'm calling it a professional enough appearance that you're going to be comfortable turning on the video. So you find the right standard for that. But again, it's hard to underestimate the value of video. So do what you need to do to feel comfortable turning that on. And then, of course, taking care of your health. I'm not sure how many folks have been examining their steps per day during COVID. I think we all had an aspiration that we'd be hitting 15,000 steps a day. And there's been some days where you look down and realize that your device is telling you you've only hit 1,500 steps. So use that data to drive better habits. And then, of course, as a team, holding each other accountable, honoring that working agreement, being, again, extraordinarily specific on when you're going to meet and collaborate and what formats you're going to do that in, and being willing to have the tough conversations. This isn't about consensus, but it's about a team that's willing to at least disagree and commit, right? Because during this time, there's not a lot of space for ambiguity. You add to that, I'm talking about it in the space of COVID, but you've also noticed, particularly in Houston and other very energy heavy industries, is the economy and the impacts on our companies is significant. No less at BP, not only are we dealing with COVID, but we've also announced that there'll be 10,000 folks leaving the company, right? So we need to be very generous, very empathetic, and very kind to one another during this time. We don't need to add any additional stress where there is already a lot. So find ways to have some fun, right? In times like this, create moments for listening. Some folks are doing this through cocktail hours. Some are doing this through icebreakers. Whatever works for you, just make sure that you're doing it. Try not to keep every session about work. Leave some room for levity and, again, for getting to know each other. And then, of course, put aside some time to get the work done. We need to deliver the business in 2020. Super important. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Stephanie. Very appropriate timing to hand over to Stephanie. As I mentioned, she's been leading on digital learning for BP, and this is definitely her sweet spot. So Stephanie, over to you.
Thanks, Shannon. And just before I get going, I do want to encourage you all to submit questions in the Q&A. I've answered a few that have come in. I'm hoping that we'll have a couple of minutes right at the end to answer any questions that we may not get to via just answering in the Q&A chat there. So encourage you to put your questions in and vote. We'll try to make sure we get through those. So as Shannon mentioned, it's important, obviously, to establish your working agreement. And a big part of that is actually being very specific on the communication and collaboration tools that you will use. I think it's important also, I know you see here on the screen little icons, which mostly align to Microsoft. Within BP, we are a very focused Microsoft strategic partner. We recognize in the companies that you work in that might be different tool sets. So use these as examples and align to what you might have available within your own company, as it will likely vary. I think the other important thing to mention is while we're talking about tools, it's really not about necessarily the technology itself. In the current environment we're in, this is really about how we stay connected and how we make things transparent and how we can work in this very challenging environment, especially in the BP sense of where we're not used to necessarily working remotely like this all the time. So when it comes to the technology and tools, it's much more important to focus on the ability to maintain that open dialogue, that discussion, then transparency, and the access to information, because it really helps reinforce the elements of trust and rapport within the team. I think the other thing, just as a learning professional, I'm always very concerned about the skills and making sure that people feel like they're on equal footing. So it's also important to make sure that team members who may not be as familiar with all the tools that are agreed to use, to make sure that they get that upskilling so that they're all on equal footing, and to really be supportive of each other and use this time to actually redirect them to learning resources and support and learn together as a team. So when it comes to the tools, I just do a quick walkthrough. And again, these are examples from, a Microsoft sense, but you can relate to whatever tools you might have available within your own kind of company or access to. So if we start on the left-hand part of the slide, it's really important from a creation perspective. So Shannon talked about creating your working agreement. And so one of the things we encourage our teams to do is to leverage tools like Whiteboard or even Mural, for example, to be able to have that brainstorming session. And it's a great way to capture a working agreement, for example. Another opportunity is to really help make sure that notes from meetings that are being had or held are actually captured in a place that make them accessible and transparent. So OneNote, for example, in the Microsoft Suite is one of the ways to do that. From a collaboration perspective, leveraging tools such as Teams or Slack to be able to have that dialogue. And I think Shannon talked also about being really clear in your working agreement around what actually needs to happen through meetings versus what would need to happen through email versus what would actually happen through a tool where you're dialoguing like in a discussion channel or a thread. And obviously, I think we're all at a point, I know certainly with meeting overload and email overload, getting really clear and crisp on where you could minimize email and keep things more collaborative and inclusive, and leveraging technology to do that is really important. I would say the middle bucket around communication, absolutely being clear around your working hours. I think at this point, as Shannon talked about, whether it's pets, children, aging parents, grandparents, whoever you may have as housemates or office mates even at this point, you may not necessarily be on the same hours across the team. So being clear of what those hours are and how you want to communicate. And then if there is the opportunity to leverage, whether you're using Teams or Slack, what gets posted out on Yammer, if you're using WhatsApp or Skype or the different technologies, but being really clear and crisp around how you're leveraging your communication channels for that is really important. And then I would say from the last bucket on the right-hand part of the slide is around visual management. So again, there are a number of different tools in this space, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this in depth, but really important from having that one central place where you can manage your backlog and have full transparency of what's on that backlog around who's doing what, who's claiming particular pieces of work and how that's progressing is really important. I would just say, go ahead, Shannon, if we go to the next slide, when it comes to the tools, I think one of the things that's also important to talk about when it comes to your working agreement is we're inviting people into your homes whenever you're turning on video, and that's also another thing to encourage, just having that interaction because you're missing each other face to face. So leveraging videos and cameras, obviously on large sessions, sometimes we tell people not to do video just because of bandwidth and network connectivity, but it's also important to be transparent of you may not want everyone to see everything behind you. And I will tell you, it's often intriguing. You learn a lot about your coworkers from the backgrounds that you see behind them. So it's helpful to know that some of the tools like Teams has features where you can blur your background. So you'll see on the slide, we've got Laura, who's actually on my team, and her two pets, Daisy and Atia, who are frequent members of all of our meetings, but in some cases, Atia and Daisy don't necessarily want to be part of our meetings, so Laura can blur her background using that feature. Teams, for example, has also added the feature like I'm using now, where you could actually just change the image behind you. So rather than showing you the guest bedroom that I'm working in at home, I'm showing you a fake background by using one of the backgrounds that I've picked in Teams. So leveraging the tool sets to help give you that privacy and help make sure that you feel comfortable, because it is, again, about creating that opportunity for you to collaborate, build trust within your team. So leverage the tools to your benefit in that sense. If we move on to practice number 5, this is really around establishing a team schedule. So this is really specific, gives you the opportunity to be very precise about when and how the team will meet. And I was just mentioning, at this point in time, people have different schedules. I know I have a toddler at home, so there's nap time. So I have to block out my calendar when I put him down for a nap. So we're all kind of working around our own potential things that we've got going on in our personal lives. So it's really important as a team to agree that specific schedule of how and when you're going to meet. So we see an example of a structured schedule on the slide. It's important to do that planning session, and we generally recommend to our teams do that earlier in the week, so that way you can be very clear about what's on the backlog or on the to-do list. We also encourage our Agile teams to do daily sessions where they're reviewing progress, surfacing impediments, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. I would say, as Shannon just mentioned, it's equally important to have some unstructured time where you actually can do work. And I think that's one of the things that I personally block out time in the afternoons with our company. A lot of our team members are based in the UK, so our mornings are very heavy on meetings. And so the afternoons are actually when I have my work time, which I block out on my calendar so that I can actually have time to focus and concentrate. But I also tried to make sure it's important to let your team members know how you can be reached. So if they want to have time to be able to problem solve or work on something together, so having that as part of your agreement is important too. And Shannon, you did mention, which I'll just highlight again here, I think it's, we're talking about structured time for meetings and reviews, whether that's planning sessions, dailies, retros, review sessions to be able to showcase the work that's been done, work time where you can actually have that focus time. But then I think the other thing you mentioned, I'll just highlight again, is it's also important to have some social time. So we've encouraged teams and our own team do the same thing where we've had virtual coffees, we've had virtual happy hours, we've had trivia sessions for lunch and learns. So encouraging a bit of that fun because you're not getting the hallway or the water cooler kind of talk just to be able to catch up and socialize with your colleagues. I think the only thing that we, and it's very challenging, and this is about, as Shannon talked about, setting boundaries, but there is a tendency to have meeting fatigue. So I think having that clear conversation with your team around how you strike that balance between what meetings do you really have to have, the working time, and just being reflective and adaptive of what's not working and making adjustments to address any issues. So if we go to practice number 6, this is all about the backlog. So this is specifically around developing a team backlog, which is really a set of work items that need to be delivered. So when you're developing your backlog, you really start with the outcomes first and what value are you creating and for who. I would say the most important things absolutely go to the top of the backlog, and that's going to be prioritized again by value. You then agree to work the items at the top of the backlog to a high fidelity and then make sure that there's real clarity around what it means to be done. I would say use planning sessions to break it down into smaller sets of activity to deliver those outcomes, and then continue to prioritize or reprioritize based on value and circumstance. And I think one thing that we are encouraging, and I have to remind myself, is that it's okay that work's going to fall off the backlog, and it's okay to let go. It's especially in this time we've had to identify things that just aren't getting done, or we need to change because the environment and the circumstances have completely changed. I would say if we go to the next slide, just reinforcing the element of value. We've seen the impacts, and you'll see on the image there, just the essence of the energy industry itself and the impacts that COVID-19 has had, especially on the energy industry. So we are very much in a place where we are capacity constrained, budget constrained. It's a challenging market. So we are absolutely being forced to prioritize because of economic conditions. So it really comes down to the quote that we have there on the slide around focusing on how much value is being delivered over how much work is being done. And really, again, that goes back to prioritizing the backlog and making sure that you're focused on the value delivery. If we go to the 7th practice, we've defined the backlog, but we also are encouraging our teams to use digital tools to visualize and track the backlog. And again, that comes back to the tool conversation of where I picked up on the presentation. It's less about the specific tool, but it's really about that transparency and the ability for the team to have full visibility of what work has been agreed as priority and who's doing what and how that work is being progressed against that definition of done. So again, in BP, we leverage a lot of our Microsoft tools given our strategic partnership, but recognize that there are a number of other tools in the market, whether that's Jira, Trello, lots of different examples of different tools that you can use to visualize the backlog and track that delivery. But whichever tool it is, it doesn't really, honestly, it's whatever makes sense within the context of your company or what's available to you. But it really is about making that agreement with the team so that we understand what the checklist is for each specific item, assigning which team, being clear of which team members are working those items, putting dates next to them, and having that true radical transparency around the work that's being done, and helping highlight where things are getting stuck or if they're blocked. And I think that's one of the most important things around the transparency and surfacing impediments so that they can be unblocked to be able to get progressed. So again, practice 7 is all about using digital tools to your benefit to help visualize and track the backlog. And I will say this is definitely one of the areas we've had such a very rapid shift in BP. We had a lot of teams obviously using physical boards, and we've had to radically make that transition to digital tools. So if we go to practice number 8, this is, I mentioned the daily when we talked about the specific schedule, but I think it's important to give just a little bit more detail around what that means. So from a daily perspective, this is really a point within the team's working agreement and establishing that schedule of when they're going to connect. We recommend, in order to keep the communication lines open, that the teams actually should meet daily to discuss and review the backlog. I would say typically you would have 15-minute kind of stand-ups or dailies, but in our sense, we've also recommended to teams to add a little bit of time to it, just because it's important to also do that connection at the beginning of the call of how are you doing? How are you coping? How are things going? Just being able to have some of that social connection and just checking in, which is hard to do, as well as cover everything specifically that you need to talk to on those like short specific elements of a stand-up. So it's really important to, potentially add in some time. I know on how we're doing it now is we actually do 30 minutes and we dedicate the first 15 minutes to the true, what did you get done? What will I do today? Any blockers or impediments? And then we can use the other 15 minutes if we need to help, check in with the team, do anything else. So it's important, again, just to establish that schedule and have that regular connection, because in this current environment that we're in, obviously we're not being able to chat across the cube or in the hallway or pop by someone's desk. So having that dedicated and regular time frame to be able to connect with the team is very important. I would say the other thing is that just also reflecting of like, is that timing working? And I think that's also part of the regular inspection and adaptation. I know within my own team, we had to move the meeting around because it actually wasn't working well for the time slots that we picked. So just being able to reflect on how are you getting out of the meetings that you've set up, what you actually need. All right, so I'm gonna move us on to number 9. So I think one thing that we've done within BP that has worked quite well is that we are really pushing resources on teams. So we have to be resourceful in this space around curating insights and learning offers to help support this transition. So it's not only the transition of working remotely and managing through a global pandemic, but it's also helping our teams reinforce and building muscle in these new practices and skills, whether that's building a backlog, using the digital tools, reinforcing that working agreement. So one of the things that we've done that's worked really well and been able to respond very quickly in the environment is creating internal micro learnings, or we also refer to them as bite-sized learnings. So very short 30-minute, 45-minute, or even 60-minute type webinars on very focused short topics that give team members, employees, tips and tricks on how to make the most of whether it's the working agreement or visual management, or how to use the, make the most out of some of our tools. So really leveraging those kind of micro learnings or bite size, we're finding super helpful, because literally people don't have hours upon hours to sit through training at this point. So, 30, 45 minutes is actually fits quite nicely with most people's schedules at this point, and it gives them what they need to then be productive. I would also say on the flip side, it's not all about creating a lot of internal learning offers, but it's also about leveraging external resources and insights. And there's tons out there, as you will know. So sessions like this, or Agile Shift conference, there's loads of sessions that have been recorded. So lots of resources from partners like Improving, but there's also loads of articles, there's podcasts, there's a wealth of information, not just around Agile practices and working remotely, but also how to help teams manage through this very difficult and challenging time of a global pandemic, whether that's helping support kind of adjusting as a family to now being home all the time, whether that's, insights around managing stress and well-being. There's lots of external resources and insights. And with MVP, we're really trying to leverage both, whether that's creating our internal offers, but then also marrying it up with where there's lots of external resources and insights. So make use of the resources is number 9. If we move on to number 10, As a learning professional, so my job is specifically around creating learning offers and making them available for both kind of digital and agility are the two areas of my focus within BP. So we've got lots of great content, but I think it's always important, and I always really appreciate being able to give people learning tips of how to make the most of learning. I will tell you that a lot of our learning offers, and we did have a couple of questions in the Q&A about our learning offers, were very heavily focused on classroom. One, because we really promote the idea of interactive learning and experiential learning. So being able to do, ball exercises or flip charting, whiteboarding, and having that in-person classroom experience has been fantastic. But obviously, as Shannon described, as we came into February, we realized, oh, wow, our entire plan of how we were delivering training is no longer going to work. We don't have classrooms, everyone's working remote, so we need to be able to adapt. And doing online learning it can be challenging. So not everyone is really a fan, I would say, of online learning, but in this sense, we are adapting and we're learning how to make it work for everyone. So what we put on this particular tip is really some suggestions on how you can make the most from online learning so that you can keep learning even when we're not actually in a real physical classroom. So some of the tips that I want to cover is, first one is learning is all about making a plan. Just like having a backlog for the work that you as an Agile team are going to complete, having your own specific learning plan is super important. And when you write things down, just like having it, the objectives and the goals that you as a team are writing down, it's the same thing for you as an individual. So making sure that you've got clear written views on what your motivations are, what your learning goals are, it's really important. So make a plan. I would say the second thing that we encourage our employees to do when it comes to online learning is get organized and stick with it. I know it's very easy to get pulled in many different directions while you're online. You've got meetings, you've got emails, you've got IMs that might be popping up. So if you can eliminate some of the distractions, that's super helpful because it allows you to focus and avoid that context switching where we know you lose value whenever you switch between different things. So get organized by creating a schedule, eliminating those distractions. I also encourage employees to actually put learning time, build it in like a meeting on your calendar and protect it like you would a meeting for your boss. So make that learning time reoccurring so it becomes a bit of a habit. And then repeatable. So again, that reoccurring meeting notice to where it becomes just something that you know that you're going to do some learning time and you've blocked it out and it's time that you don't get overrun by other meetings. The last tip I would say is make it social. I would say this is honestly no different than when you set other goals. It's helpful if you've got colleagues, family members, others rooting you on. So getting those, colleagues to share, informal social learning groups to share. Those are all absolute ways to help make it social so that you actually are encouraged to keep learning. So one of the things that we've done internal in BP, we've had Yammer groups where we encourage employees to post progress that they're making on their online learning in the Yammer groups, and they post copies of their certificates and other things. So that's one of the ways, along with supporting communities of practice. We even have study groups. So there's lots of ways that you can make learning social, even whenever we're in a global pandemic and everyone's working from home. So hopefully those are some tips that you can take away as part of supporting your online learning to keep going. I just want to come to our 4 takeaways, and then we should have just a couple of minutes to answer any questions if you've got any that are going to come in. So as far as 4 takeaways from the session, I think Shannon covered at the very beginning. It's a very challenging environment. Everyone has different personal circumstances they're bringing to the table. We're still trying to focus on delivering value through our jobs, but it starts with all of us being kind and understanding and patient with another. It's a very trying time. The second takeaway is all about transparency. The more we can be transparent and what kind of work-related activity we're having, team communication, servicing impediments, it really builds trust within the team. So the more transparent, the more trust, and it's such a core component to the base of everything else that you'll be able to achieve as a team, really on that foundation of transparency and trust. Number 3 is about the technology. again, it's not about which specific tool necessarily, but it's really a means to an end. So the technology is helping keep us connected despite the distance, and hopefully making your lives easier by being more productive and more efficient, whether that's being able to capture the notes, visualize your backlog, communicate, be inclusive with your messaging so people are aware of what's being done. All of those things really help promote collaboration. And then finally, our fourth takeaway is about inspection and adaptation. And it's, again, the focus on value. So everything's changed. We know we have to adapt and inspect and change as well. And again, keep that focus or that continuous focus on that prioritization for value, not just about how much work is getting done. So again, that focus is on prioritization. So with that, I just want to say thank you. Hope everyone stays healthy. Please stay safe. If there are any questions that we haven't answered, we've got about 4 minutes according to my clock left, so we can actually address some of those now. But Shannon, I'm just going to see if you have anything you would like to add as far as any of the content that I covered, if you want to add anything or address those while I take a look at the Q&A.
Thank you, Stephanie. So again, everyone, I hope that was helpful. I hope you found some tips that you can use. And again, this is beyond maybe our Agile team pilots. This is about just good practices for all of our teams during this time. And I wanted to mention another thank you. So we are here today because of our relationship with Improving. And I just wanted to make sure that we extend a moment of gratitude to Improving for all the work that they've been doing with BP over the last 2 years to really help us build this culture for agility, being there for us, helping deliver our training and also coaching our Agile teams and getting them to that high performing. So thank you to Devlin and the team for everything you've done and the fantastic partnership so far.
Perfect. So Shannon, we do have a couple of questions. Maybe we can just answer them over audio. I am going to give you one if that's okay. So there is a question around how to BP implement Agile teams across the company, describe the transformation process. Do you want to take a quick view?
In 30 seconds or less.
Yeah.
So that's a great, thank you for asking the question. We're very excited and happy to talk about our Agile journey. So it started with just a pilot. We had some folks saying that we think there might be a different way, and we've got some complex challenges that we need to go after. So we'd had some very minor experiments with Scrum in the software space, and we decided to try applying Scrum on a more business-facing process. We did this small. We started with 4 pilot teams in a country called Azerbaijan. So that's a little bit out sort of in the border between Europe and the East. And those 4 teams set off. They were all business-facing teams. We started with Scrum, but I just want to say we were also doing Kanban, Scrumban, and a myriad of practices. So this isn't about one, it's about what's fit for purpose. And it took off. Not only did they deliver a massive increase in cycle time, but the team vibe, the energy, the motivation that came with it set an example or a lighthouse for others in the company. And soon enough, we'd call this a grassroots movement. We started to get calls. Our phones were ringing off the hook, or rather our chats and our emails were ringing off the hook with requests to bring Agile out to different sites across BP. So very much started as a very small isolated pilot, gained movement, and then also picked up the notice of our executives. So you'll also hear all the way up to Bernard Looney, our new CEO, talking about agility and the importance of that for BP. So I know that's a very fast answer, but it was a very small, like with all things, just do something, start somewhere. We followed the Agile iterative approach, and then it's been a constant iteration thus far. I think if we're allowed to share some numbers, working with Stephanie and the learning team, we have reached over 9,000 people with our Agile learning offers. And then we've launched over 500 Agile teams.
Great. Shannon, there was one.
We have time for one more question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, Shervin, I'm taking over.
We have time for one more question. So for you and Stephanie, celebrating success is an important part of our team standards. How have you done remote celebrations?
That is a great question. So I think that, and it's so important, is how do the teams actually step back and reflect? So I will say some of this occurs digitally. We have a very active Yammer group where folks go online and they share stories. And a lot of the way the recognition comes in is they share their story and then they get recognition from their peers asking for information or asking for more sharing. And we're celebrating each other in that lens.
We've also had our CEO drop into the middle of some of our Agile team calls. So just sort of skyrocketing in and surprising them, which is its own form of recognition. And similarly from other leaders in the company joining in to recognize and honor those teams. But at the end of the day, it's a bit like the retrospective for the team to be recognizing the team, whether that's through that coffee chat or that informal time together to really reflect on what they've accomplished, how they accomplished it, and how they're going to repeat that. So that's probably not, it's a bit of a woolly answer, but the reason being is it's occurred in a number of different formats. Just recently, a team from our Chicago office shared a video onto Yammer talking, they filmed it virtually, by the way. They posted it to Yammer and they got recognition from all over the company about what they had done. So that's, and that's very much driven by the team. Nobody asked them to do it. So Stephanie, is there anything you would add to that?
I was just going to say, I think, we've had teams that do fun things, whether that's doing the virtual happy hour or doing kind of virtual celebrations. And I think the only other thing that we have within VP is we do have a what's called an Energize program. So you can send thank yous that are visible to the company. We've obviously in the current economic times have kind of limited the amount of points or rewards that you can give people that are, that would relate to some kind of financial value. But the thank yous go a very long way when it comes to recognition. So being able to provide that, whether that's through a town hall or through our Energize system, and being able to acknowledge the work that teams have done and how they've delivered has been important too.
Motivation, autonomy, and purpose.
That's right.
Always a win.
That's right.
Thank you all for attending today's session, and Shannon and Stephanie, thank you for sharing. We value continuous improvement and your feedback. Please complete a survey for this session by logging into sketch.com, locating the session, and then clicking the feedback survey button. The recording of the session will be available the next business day. To view the recording, locate the session from sketch.com and click the video stream button. We hope you enjoyed the rest of Virtual Agile Shift. Have a great day.
Stay healthy, everyone.
Thank you.